I'm here to introduce Nicholas O'Brien. He is an artist, writer, and game designer. He also founded XA Games, which uses unconventional storytelling methods that you will find in experimental films and by video artists. So give it up for Nicholas O'Brien.
Hi everyone. Hi. Yeah, I'm gonna just jump right in. I'm gonna get started. I have these notes and stuff, so I'm gonna read from them, just a heads up. But I promise I'll re-engage as much as I can and not lose my place. But yeah, we're just gonna jump right in. Cool? Great. Are we all good with recording and stuff like that? Good? Okay, awesome, excellent. Hello. Thanks so much for IGDA NYC and Coexist Gamespace for hosting me. It's actually really huge honor to be here today and to talk about designing emotive games. As a brief introduction, building just a little bit off of what was already said, and for folks that might not know me, or that I'm just meeting for the first time, I'm Nicholas O'Brien. I'm an artist and game designer and writer based in Brooklyn, and I founded a small game design studio here in Brooklyn called SA Games. At the studio, I make introspective, narrative-driven games about complex topics inspired by personal experience and extensive research. This past spring, I self-published a game called Bundle of Joy, which you can play in the showcase later, about becoming a dad during the pandemic. Making this game really made me reconsider a lot of the techniques I'd been using as a narrative designer to elicit specific emotional responses from the player. And I want to share a bit about the process and what I learned and researched during that time with all of you this evening. But first, I think it might be helpful for our discussion if I give a bit more context to what I mean by SA games and how my studio isn't the only one making them. So I started using this term loosely to define a trend I was witnessing in indie games and alternative art game circles. I was looking at games like Sibel and by Nina Freeman and That Dragon Cancer by Numinos Games, and games like Promesa by Julian Palacios, Bury Me My Love by The Pixel Hunt, and games by Studio Oleomingus. That's kind of clockwise there. These titles were told from specific perspectives with specific authorial voices that discussed very particular topics. Additionally, these games mirrored the style of a personal essay, right? Some of these games were based on research and collaboration with subject matter experts, and some of these games were based on personal experience. But regardless of approach and execution, this type of game was attempted to do something slightly different than a lot of other titles that I was seeing at the time, like this. This was Metal Gear Solid 5 was released concurrently to a lot of these other games. They were trying to tell complex, nuanced, and intimate stories while contending with the unique formal qualities of games as a medium. So as someone that went to art school for film and video, I recognized this stylistic approach almost right away. It reminded me of avant-garde essay films I watched as a young artist. Chris Marker's Sans Soleil, which is pictured here, for example, used the plasticity of video and early digital nonlinear editing techniques to talk about loss, memory, otherness, and the malleability of cultural history. In Farun Haruki's Serious Game series, the artist examines the ways in which digital rendering and 3D simulation are used to both train and treat American soldiers in forever wars overseas. Or another essay film by Chantal Akerman, News from Home, where the filmmaker reads letters from her mother against the backdrop of late 1970s Manhattan, resulting in a haunting meditation on family and home. These pieces, and many others by artists and filmmakers spanning decades of experimental work, are loosely grouped as essay films, or films that use the personal narrative and formal qualities of the moving image as a means for addressing larger social, political, and interpersonal issues. So games, too, obviously, can do this. They can use the primary formal qualities of interactivity, nonlinearity, ludonarrative emergence, and all that good stuff, and use them to talk about sensitive material. And this is what I wanted to do with my games. I wanted to make a game that was like an essay film, and follow in the footsteps of many inspiring creative folks working in this vein. This 1979 Revolution, Black Friday, The Tea Room by Robert Yang is the bigger image, and then Despelote below, more recently. Okay, so this ethos of essay games is what shapes the studio that I run and my work, and also serves as a nice backdrop to talk more about my more recent game, Bundle of Joy, which you can play later tonight, like I said. You can also get it on Steam and Itch. But before we're kind of getting into it, let's watch the trailer, if we can. But I realize that I'm not on the internet, so we probably can't. So, okay, we'll just skip it. It's really cute. You should go watch the trailer.
There's Wi-Fi if you want. The Wi-Fi's right there.
Oh, the Wi-Fi's right there. No, I'd rather just look at this image and be sad. You can go watch the trailer. It's whatever. You can find it. Let's see. We can move on. Okay. So, if you couldn't quite tell from that trailer, A Bundle of Joy is a WarioWare game peppered with narrative elements about becoming a parent during the pandemic. It's a lighthearted yet vulnerable take on some of the big emotional and physical shifts that happened to me and other dads I know and talk to, mixed up in the anxieties of the lockdown of early COVID. And yes, my daughter is in the trailer. That's why it's super fucking cute. And yes, the game is about her. And no, I don't think she quite knows that yet. And yes, this is me with her shortly after she was born. So you might be asking, how is this possible? How do you make a lighthearted game about something so serious and intense? Early parenthood is already heavy. And then you want to also drag in the psychological traumas that happened during the pandemic too? And truthfully, it wasn't super easy. My initial design rounds were not very approachable. They were filled with anger and regrets and remorse and stress and anxious writing and random elements without allowing for strategic thinking or action. It was a mess. But it was also a very important mess for me to design and work through as an artist and individual. And what I found in the initial design, which was much more of a walking simulator with contemplative narrative vignettes, was that folks were interested in the material but didn't enjoy its delivery. I asked trusted community members, designers, playtesters, and friends why the material wasn't landing. And a lot of the feedback I obtained was that the text and the gameplay weren't matching up. The player wasn't actually feeling. Instead, the narrative was telling the player how they should feel. And these are screenshots from an early prototype of that game that went by a different name called The Trailing Edge. So this was a huge design flaw. Because when you tell someone how they should feel, they automatically balk, right? Even in immersive simulations with high-fidelity AAA products, if you say directly to the player, "Now you're mad," it's very hard for the player to actually meet you in that emotional state. So, how do we get around this? How do you design an emotive game where you have an intended emotional objective that you want the player to reach? The first step for me is to think about how you want the player to obtain that objective through a variety of different gameplay outcomes. And so for here, I'm using language borrowed from Tracy Fullerton, who's an amazing academic. Yeah, big ups to Tracy Fullerton, in her excellent book, Game Design Workshop. In the Design Basics section, Fullerton introduces a list of 8 considerations, quote unquote, that a designer can take when first developing their idea. And I won't dwell on all of them here. You should really go seek out this book if you haven't read any of it. But within these, she outlines the differences between objective, the overall goal of the game, and outcomes, right? The results of players attempting to achieve that stated goal. So outcomes can be multifaceted, they can be layered, and they don't always result in success. But designers can consider, according to Fullerton, how to create different paths for players to pursue an objective to create more complex states of play or immersion. So outcomes themselves can be emergent depending on the kind of game, right? And also can be completely secondary to the intended objective. An example in chess, for example, would be an outcome could be that you get your pawn to the other side of the table and you resuscitate a lost piece. But maybe that will help you get towards your intended objective. So another example could be that you want to score the most points to win. To achieve this, you could run through the game normally, or you could farm points from some overlooked glitch. You could risk an unconventional strategy, but don't actually get a high score. Or someone could come up with a novel strategy to multiply their points to achieve previously unthinkable scores. This might sound familiar to some people. All of these are different outcomes to reach the same objective. But what if the objective wasn't about points or missions or solving puzzles, but instead revolved around a feeling? What if the objective was to feel shame or pity or anxiety or joy? What outcomes could you design to intentionally lead the player towards that objective, even if the outcome doesn't always result in achieving the objective? So how do you create mechanics and gameplay around those outcomes and objective? So luckily, and for people that might not know, this is Red Dead Redemption 2. Arthur looking very sad. And this is Greece, a very good platformer made by a studio in Spain. So luckily, going on, I'm not the only one who has been thinking about this. And a group of really smart game developers at the Polaris Game Design Retreat wrote a paper called There Is No Wheel, a framework for creating emotionally resonant game mechanics. And I won't cite the entire paper back to you. That would be kind of redundant. And also you can find it online for free. But the first step that they advised is to look at the overall context of what you're making and determine the central themes. So does your game deal with death? Does your game tackle overcoming strife? Does your game deal with forming strong bonds? And this might feel like a fairly rudimentary step, but oftentimes designers will skip over this and dive right into the mechanics or genre. They'll want to make a deck builder or a dual stick shooter first and then worry about the themes after. And that's fine. You can do that, but you might struggle to build an emotive experience. So the authors of the Polaris text go on to outline other tactics and practical measures for designers to consider, but I wanted to skip ahead, even though I said not to a moment in their recommendations that I think references some of what I mentioned earlier in my spiel about essay games. Near the conclusion of their framework, they recommended the designer consider how the player can insert themselves into the piece and bring their own experiences to your work, like Flynn in the original Tron. That's what that gets from. I would slightly augment this recommendation and instead suggest that designers don't placate to player personality, but instead leverage a technique widely found within essay films and essay games. And this is one of the most important aspects of essay films as a so-called genre. It's that they often not only tell a story, but they also utilize a very important narrative feature: ambiguity. Now, not all essayistic media needs to have ambiguity, but it consistently comes up as an intentional methodology for giving space to the reader of the essay or media to come to their own conclusions and feelings about what they've experienced. Oftentimes, ambiguity is perhaps mistakenly considered a weak stance, a kind of shruggy posturing that refuses to take a side. Or at worst, it comes across as, yeah, whatever the audience gets out of it, that's cool. But that's not ambiguity, that's laziness. Intentional, purposeful ambiguity asks questions, but doesn't provide concrete answers. It muses about the state of something, but doesn't try to reach a dogmatic conclusion that audiences must adhere to. Confidently executed ambiguity initiates conversation and discourse, and never falls into the all too often pit of pandering and preaching that has grown in popularity across all types of media. So ambiguity allows designers to create space to explore emotions without judgment. When successfully employed, ambiguity prevents an experience from having a predetermined particular emotional response, but instead provides conditions for the kind of response that you hope for or are designing towards. So in other words, ambiguity opens up opportunities for more outcomes for the player. Again, no one really likes to be told what to do or think or feel. They want to do all those things themselves, exercising their free will and plugging their own personal experiences to connect with or reject the subject matter. If you give the audience room to do this and use design techniques that encourage filling in small incremental ways, then chances are you'll be more successful in getting the player to reach your intended emotional objective. I think it's fitting that Elder Maggie is gambling here. I don't know. There's like something related there. Okay. So how, right? How do you include ambiguity? It can be a bit tricky, right? But I've often leaned into a design technique that I first saw analyzed in Jasper Yule's text, Without a Goal. In his critical essay, Yule outlines some design innovations unfolding in early to mid-aughts. He argues that games like GTA San Andreas and The Sims 2 are moving the design goalpost away from traditional goals and goal-oriented game structures. But what's of particular interest for me as a designer in this text is how he talks about the design of Sims 2 rewarding player behavior not based on achieving goals, but rather on expressing personal taste. He states the player can play based on aesthetic considerations. The player does not have to choose an optimal chair, but can choose a beautiful chair. And so this design methodology, forefronts what you would call expressive play, a form of play that leverages player choice for arranging the game's components based on personal aesthetic, or in our case, emotional decisions. So to give players expressive means to rearrange the parts of your game so that they feel they're making aesthetic choices that still have some ounce of consequence within the game world is another design tactic to creating emotional experiences. Because if the player starts to play expressively, then the burden of mechanical mastery fades to the background, and the emotional content can take center stage. So, kind of in short, combining expressive play with ambiguity becomes a powerful tool for designing a plethora of outcomes for your emotional objective. That's a good sentence. I should have that here instead of just, okay, anyways. So that's kind of the heady stuff, right? It's like the theory part of designing emotive games. But a lot of the time when we talk about executing these ideas, we often immediately gravitate towards writing. A game that hits you in the feels, like the title of this talk, is generally one that has decent writing, and generally is thought of as having narrative elements at its core. I'm at the bottom. Often when I read advice on how to make audiences feel something, it often resorts to writing conventions. Strong yet recognizable characters, sophisticated interweaving plots, branching narratives with multiple endings or other player agency-rich techniques, detailed world building, etc., etc. And I won't dispute that. Undoubtedly some of the most emotionally deep experiences that I've had with games have come from narrative titles. And also, I lean on narrative in my own work, so it would be kind of hypocritical for me to say that you shouldn't rely on narrative design to convey the emotional objectives of your game. But you can also consider how to let the mechanical elements of your game also carry some of that narrative load. So we feel things all the time. We feel things when we're immersed in non-narrative gameplay. Right? Frustration, triumph, relief, stress, delight, woe, and so on. We innately feel things while we interact with the interface of the game beyond reading, right? But often we don't consider how these feelings supplement or flavor the emotional content of the work or the written word. We often think of them as separate, when they really should be thought of as being complementary. I'll share an experience of how I tried to do this with Bundle of Joy. Oh, by the way, this is usually me. But when I'm designing, this is me. Anyway, okay, anyways. So I'll share an example of how I tried to do this with Bundle of Joy. I knew when I was designing the game, I wanted the players to feel a certain amount of low-key or high-key anxiety about their newfound parenting duties. After all, taking care of a kiddo is pretty stressful. So instead of telling the player that they should be stressed out now, I wanted to think about what I could do mechanically to design a scenario to get the players to reach that emotional state quickly and seamlessly. So this is actually the opening sequence of the game. You're bombarded with a crying baby. So I thought about the times in games where I've experienced stress while playing. You know, like hiding from a xenomorph in Alien Isolation, or escorting Zelda at the end of Ocarina of Time. But these games don't fit the theme of my game, right? And I certainly didn't want to create a horror game based on child rearing, though I'm sure that one has been made. Instead, I wanted to do something that thematically and aesthetically was more playful and less gruesome. So I thought about how the mini games in the Mario Party franchise would always put me on edge. The short timer also used in Ocarina of Time, the antagonistic and at times asymmetrical scenarios, combined with the uncertain controls, always made me feel stressed, but also made me feel silly. And then there's entire games, right, that are made up of mini games like WarioWare and Bishibashi, which I've only ever played at MagFest, although this is the DS version, which I've played. And I love how these games are unapologetically silly and playful. They required the player to pay attention, to act with urgency, which thematically fit what I wanted to do with Bundle of Joy. So in order to get the player to feel the stressful emotions of becoming a parent during the pandemic, I designed a system of mini games that inherently put the player in a position of uncertainty and stress. That's also me at the beginning of that, sorry. Just kidding. So then when the narrative elements of the game occur during downtime elements or after putting the baby to bed, the player is looking for relief, right? Because they're already stressed out by these mini games. They've gone through a gauntlet of tasks and they're feeling a bit on edge. The narrative then asks the player to reflect on their current situation and to equate that to larger emotional questions and on the changes that have happened to them as they become a new dad or a new parent. So this pairing, right, of mechanic with narrative is an essential part of creating emotive games. In my case, I wanted to make non-narrative gameplay to communicate one emotional objective, stress, and the narrative elements to communicate another emotional objective, relief or catharsis. But together, they serve a larger whole of what I thematically and aesthetically wanted my audience to feel while interacting with my work. So you can experience this for yourself a little bit later. I'm going to wrap things up here so that we have lots of time for question and answer and to talk about some of the stuff that I've talked about. But thank you so much again for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to chatting with everybody. Hi. Yeah?
How do you think the relationship between ambiguity and player agency directs or sort of eschews emergent narratives?
Yeah, so ambiguity is really hard in emergent design spaces, right? Because you're dealing with a lot of kind of like mechanical certainty, right? To allow for that emergence to occur, right? Usually things are kind of played off of one another to create new unexpected results, right? I think of a game like Noita, which is a good example of this, where you play a wizard kind of doing some dungeon crawling, and you can combine spells to basically create chaos, right? There's not a lot of ambiguity in that game, and it's not a narrative game, and there's not really a lot of emotional objectives in that. But in that space, there's nothing that's communicated to the player what the end result of those combinations will be. You have to experiment, right? And through experimentation, you can kind of think about ambiguity in a kind of purely mechanical standpoint being experimentation, right? Using the tools to see what emerges out of them, right? So in some ways, like maybe that's just like semantic flavoring, right? Like instead of ambiguity, you would allow for experimentation in a sandbox-like environment or an open kind of environment. But how you contend with that with like player agency, which is I think like the central thing of your question, is really interesting. I think the way that I try to do that is that I present the player, I do lean on those narrative conventions of like having branching narratives, right? But I try to introduce them in a way where they will always loop back to some mechanical need, right? So that it's not just, oh, I'm selecting this thing and like this is how I feel, right? But that by selecting that feeling, that augments the gameplay in some way, right? It has some like mechanical result, some mechanical feedback that then is filtering back into the system, right? So depending on your choices within the branching narrative sections of Bundle of Joy, for example, those kind of can shift some variables in the background that can either make things a little bit more challenging or a little bit more relieving, right?
Okay, so it's like a situated cognition of your decisions resulting in a meaningful outcome that is not emergent.
Yes, yes. So it's like,
well, sorry, resulting in an ambiguous outcome.
Right.
Not emergent.
Yes, it's not emergent. It would be ambiguous in that the ambiguity comes across in the uncertainty of knowing what that action is doing and also being communicated through the text itself, right? Even if you make certain choices, those choices mechanically are ambiguous, but also the narrative that's being told in those moments aren't saying like, oh, you chose sad, now the sadness is infiltrating every aspect of what you're doing, right? Yeah. Yeah, I think like a good word to use in that instance would be slippage, right? Making things a little slippery, right? Imperfect.
That makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah.
Good answer, thank you.
Yeah, totally.
Great,
Yeah. Yes.
Is this way of thinking about games something that you think is primarily accessible to like solo developers or to my friend for developers, or is this something that like collaborations people can access?
That's a great question. Like how would you, like another way of phrasing that maybe would be like, how does this approach translate to a team, right? I think what's interesting, without going back to my slides, two of the examples that I highlighted, Greece and Despelote to a certain extent, but I think of that being somewhat of a solo developer. But certainly Black Friday Revolution 1979, that was made by a larger studio, right? I think that the way that that's accomplished is doing that thematic road mapping early on in the process, right? Whether that be a strong ethereal voice in the writer's room that's dictating some of those thematic structures and creating some design scenarios around that, right, with your team. Or figuring out the ways in which you want to deliver the content. So in the example of like Revolution 1979, the reason why I really love that game is that it plays almost like a documentary, like a real-time documentary. And it has extensive documentarian material that you can access in its menu, and you go to an event and then it says, oh, now that you're done with this event, go look at the pictures of that event and see, compare and contrast how we're telling the story and how it happened in real life. And that is like, a mechanical feature of that game. It's not something that's hidden and tucked away. It's very front and present, right? So in that example, they're thematically talking about the complications of all the political nuances that happened in that moment in Tehran and in Iran as a country. But they're also doing it by giving credence to the playability of accessing the deeper material, the deeper kind of documentarial primary source material of the game itself. I don't know if that's like necessarily answering your question, but I always try to think of like examples of which, like where that's happening. I think needless to say, like another way of answering that question is like, it's much easier to think this way when you're a solo developer, right? You have your vision, you have your theme, you have your stance, your authorial voice, you have the thing you want to make, the piece of artwork that you want to make, right? And it's much easier to just like execute that by yourself than trying to convince other people to like follow along. Though I will say, like Bundle of Joy, I had a small team working with me on it, and a lot of it was, you know, kind of bringing people into the experience and being like, this is the kind of thing that I want this thing to be. And having people play early prototypes and have people play through the narrative elements that were prototyped in other software and be like, yeah, so this is the emotional touch tones that we're going for. How do we combine all these different elements to reinforce these touch tones, right? So the visual content, for instance, is this kind of like very crude drawing, kind of like lo-fi, low-poly thing, you know, and that was intentional because I wanted it to still have this lighthearted feel, and I wanted that to kind of be contrasted against the material being, you know, a bit heavy, right? So then working with, in the instance of Bundle of Joy, working with a technical artist to be like, how do we accomplish that? How do we accomplish that lightheartedness? How do we accomplish the sketchy feel? And you know, we went back and forth and tried to figure out a way of doing that. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to ask, how do you balance the popular or maybe commercial expectation that games are fun and escapist with the artistic urge to create experiences that are unpleasant or bittersweet? Or maybe more specifically, the Bundle of Joy. How important was fun as opposed to stress for you in the game?
That's a great question. Though I think there's kind of two questions in there, if I may. The first question is about like the commercial pressure of making something that is palatable to a wider audience. And the way that I would answer that question is that in a very honest way, I failed at doing that, right? Bundle of Joy didn't reach a massive audience, but I knew that it wouldn't, right? I knew that it wouldn't, you know, like garner this like, you know, it wasn't Balatro, right? It didn't have that innate kind of like hook, right? But it did, like, to people that are interested in looking for these types of games, you know, they did find it and they did experience it and they did, I think, enjoy it for the most part. So that's like the first side. I think if you're going in thinking about how do you design an essay game with commercial success in mind, that's going to be a tough hill to climb, right? Notably, right, like essay films are mostly shown in experimental cinemas, in very small venues. They don't have, you know, they're not being, whatever, distributed by A24 or something, right? They're like, you know, in archives at Anthology Film, right? You know, so it's like a matter of scale, right, and a matter of context and audience. The second question there of like balancing between fun and stress, I don't know. I wanted to throw players into it because that's how it is. Like you come home and you're like, shit, you know, you're like, what do I do, right? Okay, let me answer that question a different way. A part of the motivation of making Bundle of Joy was that I was trying to be a good, expecting dad, and I read literature, and I was talking to other parents, and I was, you know, doing the research, right? I was like, I'm gonna fucking kick this baby's ass. No, I'm just kidding. I'm gonna do this shit. Yeah, totally. I'm like in it. I want to do this. I'm excited, right? And I noticed that in a lot of the literature, there was this gap between 0 to 3 months. You know, it was like all the things that you do leading up to the expectations, going through labor, going through delivery, all that stuff, what you should expect. And then it was like, and then around 3 to 6 months, here's some milestones that you should look out for, right? And I was like, that's weird. What happens in that 0 to 3 month? That's really weird. That's a really weird gap. And then it happened, and I realized that what you're doing is that you're just trying to survive, right? You're just trying to get to the end of the day, like having the baby be happy and healthy, right? And yourself to a lesser degree, right? And so I was like, oh, I want to make something that's filling in that gap, right? That's like trying to provide some context for literature that I couldn't find, and to be really honest and open about that. So I am telling you that to say that it wasn't so much like, oh, I can't wait to stress out players, right? But it was more like, I really hope that this gives some insight to why there's no literature, right? I really hope that the reason why people don't talk about that time is because you black out, right? You know, but I still think that that is worth telling, right? And yeah, it's stressful, but it's also incredible, right? But it's also joyous, and it's also wild, and you go through all these different changes, right? But you also come out of it with this whole new sense of self and this whole new sense of place and belonging and home and all these different things, right? So, you know, I didn't go in being like, oh, I'm going to punish the heck out of these players, right? I wanted it to be approachable, right? I wanted it to be playable. And when I've shown it in context, I haven't had a person, and now I'm going to jinx myself with the showcase later, but I haven't had a person that's like bounced off of it like in the first minute, right? And so that to me is like, it's fun enough that they get through that initial round of stress that they can hang on for a little bit longer. Yeah. Hopefully that was a long-winded way of answering your question. Yeah, in the back.
I really like this last question and answer, and I just want to add one small thing, which is that I don't think that frustration in game design is something to be avoided at all costs. It's a color in our palette, right?
Yeah.
If you take away the frustration, it's no longer an interactive experience.
Totally.
And so when people are engaged with a new game, they don't know what the rules are, they don't know what they're supposed to do, they're always lost.
Yeah.
You want this when you're starting a new game, and I can see the metaphor, right? Just like, you know, when you're a parent for the first time,
Yeah.
you don't know what to expect, and there it is. Because I think it fits well. I haven't tried the game, I look forward to it.
Yeah.
I think it fits well, and I think, you know, we want to use frustration as a tool when we're making games. Of course, it can't be too much, it can't be of the wrong kind, it can't be at the wrong moment, but it's a necessary component of making it a game.
Yes. Kind of notably, and this is spoiler, no, notably in Bundle of Joy, you can actually see up here in the upper left-hand corner, you have this meter, that's a stress meter that's always ticking up throughout the entire game unless you're doing downtime and at the end of the game. And you will stress out, like the game is designed to stress out. But instead of that being a game over, it reveals this other aspect of the game. So like the way that I kind of designed around that is that, yeah, you'll mess up. Like parents mess up, you know, they reach stressful points and they're like, I don't know what the heck I'm doing and I gotta walk away for a second, right? I think all parents experience that, but then the game says like, that's okay. Like that's part of the journey. Like let's now like take a moment, play this other mini game that's restful and non-stressful and cathartic, and it's literally a breathing exercise, and then we'll go right back into it, right? So, you know, I didn't go into it being like, I'm gonna stress out people, but I went into it knowing like people will get stressed out, and how do I design the game to make sure that when they do get stressed out, they aren't like, you know, they aren't the like, you know, the meme taking off the headphones, right? So yeah, so that was kind of the way that maybe another way of answering that question. Yeah, in the back.
One more question.
Perfect.
Okay, great. So actually, this continuation of this theme. You know, your last point in the presentation about kind of tension and relaxation made me think about music.
Yeah.
How, you know, certain notes in the scale are kind of disharmonious and leads to more tension, certain chords and so on and so forth. And hence, like, why certain chord progressions are the way they are. Resolve on certain chords and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So how do you decide in your work when is a good point to release that tension?
Such a good question, dude. Such a good question. Without being flippant, like a musician would, you know, like through playtesting, right? Through rehearsal, like a musician would, right? Through experimentation, through seeing how people are reacting to the moment, and then being like, okay, we have to pump the brakes here, right? But your question is so wonderful in that music, when I talk about this with my students a lot, music is insane. As a art form, it is so abstract. Like when you really think about it, like how music can be evocative and like profound and moving, it's just sound, right? There's not, sometimes there's crappy images that come with it, right? But like, that is so abstract. It's such an abstract medium, right? But when it works so intangibly well. It's so sublime, right? It's just like thinking about it, even talking about it now, it's like, making the hairs on the back of my neck like stand up, right? Like I know that everybody's had that sensation and that feeling. And, games can approach that, right? But they're not nearly as abstract, right? They have a lot more formal and physical aspects to them, right? And I think the way that I try to balance that I try to find that harmony, right, is thinking about when do I feel like I'm being pushed to my limit, right? When do I feel like I need to take a break, or I need to figure out something that I need a moment to myself or something. Yeah, and then just like get other people to look, listen, play, feel, right? Playtesting. I mean, it seems like such a canned answer, but truly, like there's nothing better than just like having other people experiencing it and them being like, this is working, or this is not working, or this is achieving the thing that you're hoping it will achieve or not, right? Or I'm not getting there yet, right? It's not landing in the way that I want. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.